Is firing up here, and it looks like we are now live. Okay. Good evening, everybody. This is Sean McVeigh with Sean's Outdoor Adventures, and I want to welcome you to another live show here, partnering with Bowtech to bring you this series. I'm going to just hang out for a minute here and let some people get signed on. Typically, once we go live, it takes anywhere up to 5 minutes for all the notifications to go out and stuff like that. So I try to just hang out for a minute and give people a chance to get logged in and up on the live feed. So this evening, my plan is to talk about trying to age deer on the hoof. And that's something that is a pretty hot topic. It's important, especially when we're practicing quality deer management, or we're just trying to manage the deer herd. But a lot of people in the hunting world nowadays, they really want to try to manage for more mature deer. So looks like some people are popping on. How you doing, Kurt? Michael, how you doing? Evan, how are you? Opening archery this Saturday in Wisconsin. Can't wait. I'm sure you cannot. Good luck to you, Evan. Jerry, my brother, how are you? Frank, good to have you on. Timothy, how are you? From Kentucky. Andrew, how's it going over there? AJ, thanks for tuning in. Thunderbird Hunting Show, howdy, buddy. Brad, how you doing? Upchurch 786, how you doing? Steve Wright, how you doing? Soggy Salad, welcome. Email Max, Jarrett. I just shouting out to some of the people signing on. I just want to welcome everybody. So looks like people are jumping on, and we're going to be getting ready to go soon here. Also, I want to give a thanks to those of you who got the text message alert for this live stream and jumped over to the live feed from there. Appreciate you doing that. So this stream is going out all over the place, and it looks like we got a ton more people jumping on. Eric, how you doing? Corey Davis, Jamie, a lot of people jumping on. So thank you for getting on here. Again, tonight's topic is aging deer on the hoof, and this is a very challenging thing to do. It takes practice, and you can get a room full of people, and there's going to be a majority of people guessing an age of a deer around the same age, but you're going to have outliers. You're going to have some people look at a deer and say that's a 2.5-year-old deer. You have someone else in the room say that's a 4.5-year-old deer. So it's a challenging process, and it's just something that you just have to do your best to make a good judgment call on. Now, as you know, obviously this is a live show, so I don't have a bunch of pictures to show. For example, I am going to make some references to some of the deer behind me here. I also have a lot of racks. I got them laid out on the table here. I'm going to use them for some topics that I want to talk about. But the funny thing is, I've actually tried to draw some of this stuff on my little board over here as a visual example. I guarantee you that the majority of viewers are going to laugh, and probably laugh hard. So I'm very poor at drawing. That was never my strong suit. I was never had that artistic ability in my drawing. It was something I always thought would be cool to have. I just never quite got it. So when you get to look at what I drew on this board, you're going to laugh. However, it serves a purpose, and the purpose is we want to really look at certain body features of the deer to try to help us gain a perspective or an idea of how old that deer might be. So before I jump into that, I just want to talk about a couple things. I generally wait till the very end to answer questions. And if you're new to watching my live feed, I'm all by myself. I'm a one-man show. And so when it comes to monitoring questions, I do it all on my live feed on looks like I just got a text from somebody who's viewing here. So anyway, so I usually just do it on my live feed on my YouTube channel. So basically, if you have a question wherever you're watching this at, go over to my Sean's Outdoor Adventures YouTube channel and ask the question there. Another thing is when you ask the question, put a question mark at the end. And the last thing is, because that question mark helps me see it with all the other stuff that's getting written, but the last thing I will say is save your question until I say throw your questions up now, because I just glanced over, there's all kinds of people writing on the message board here, and your question could easily get lost, and I don't want to lose your question. So hold on to that question until we get to the question and answer session near the end. Post it on my YouTube channel when we get to that time, and make sure you use a question mark at the end so that everything is good. Looks like, you know, people are still commenting, so I think we're good to go. I am going to transition over to the board here and start talking about deer age. So my first part here is we're going to talk about trying to age. We're mainly focusing on a buck, because that's really what a lot of people are focused on when they're hunting. And I am going to try to address a little bit of deer management in general, which includes doe, after I finish this. So let's head over here. Got my camera hand making the transition. I know this is funny. I know you're laughing. Again, I am not good at art. So I also want to say this. I hunt primarily Pennsylvania, Maryland, New York, these eastern states. However, I have hunted quite a bit in Illinois. Last year I was out in Iowa, and I guided for several years in Illinois, and I can tell you from my observation, there are some differences in the deer that I have observed in Pennsylvania and their body characteristics, and the deer that I've observed out in the Midwest. So I want to try to incorporate that as we're going along. But let me get out of the way a little bit and come over here. This is my pathetic attempt at drawing a 1.5-year-old deer. But let me just point out some of the key characteristics that we're looking at when we stare at a buck and we're trying to determine the age of the buck. One of the things that stands out a little bit more with a 1.5-year-old buck is the neck is kind of slim, and it usually comes into the chest area about midway down. It's not, you know, when we get down into here, that neck comes into the brisket area seamlessly on these older deer. But on your younger deer, it typically lands partway down the chest. And one thing that also stands out to me about these 1.5-year-old deer is they're kind of boxy shaped. So the front end and the back end are about the same distance, you know, when you're measuring from the top of the back to the bottom of the belly type of a thing. They're fairly same all the way through. You don't see real defined muscle definition in like the shoulder. They're kind of a rounded looking, you know, animal in that respect. Some people also like to point out the legs of a younger deer seem a little bit long for the body, you know, because the body's just not developed yet. So when you look at it, some people will say, oh, that deer has long legs, and that's because a lot of times you're looking at a younger deer that doesn't have that developed body. Actually, this would be a good time for me to just scroll back over here for a minute, because what we're talking about is the distance from the top of the back to the bottom of the deer. And although these are shoulder mounts, it gives us a slight perspective here. So this buck here and this buck here, those were some of my first bucks I ever got, and those are 1.5-year-old deer. And if you look at the distance from here to here, actually I brought a tape measure just so I could give a rough number. You're talking about 14 inches from here to here. Now this buck here I shot last year. This is a 2.5-year-old buck. And the distance from the top of the back to the bottom down here, the brisket, is 16 inches. So we've got a couple more inches on the mount. And then when we look at this as a 4.5-year-old deer over here, we're getting close to 19 inches. And again, these are only mannequins, so it doesn't tell the full story. However, you can get a gauge here from what I'm trying to talk about. And when you're looking at a 1.5-year-old deer, this distance in the front end is going to be pretty much equivalent coming into the back end. So let me scroll back over here. Again, I just want to mention, save your questions till the end. Those of you who are just joining us now, those of you who are clicking over from the text thread or the text alert that you got, or however, thanks for joining in. But save all questions for toward the end, and I will try to get to those when we get there. So when we're talking about that 1.5-year-old, I'm looking at the front and the back end, and I'm trying to gauge something. Now, I hunt, again, Pennsylvania a lot, and I also hunt out in the Midwest, and the body of some of these 1.5-year-old deer out in the Midwest where I've hunted are so much larger and wider. Like when you're looking at them front on, a lot of those farm-fed deer are just fat, like this way, you know, when you're looking at them from, if the deer's facing you. And in Pennsylvania, a lot of the mountain deer, they're really sleek. There's not a lot of extra weight on them. And that front, the measurement from the front to the tail, it seems shorter on a lot of these like Pennsylvania mountain deer than what you'll see in some of them farm deer out in the Midwest. However, that characteristic of this being about the same, you know, size, it's going to still be there. And I will say this, sometimes it's actually real hard to see some of these variations in these first 3 years because the deer, a lot of times, at least a lot of the mountain deer I've encountered, they don't always put on the body mass that you're going to see as prevalently out in the farm-fed deer. So sometimes I've had a little challenge, like a couple years ago, it was a slow hunt in the morning. I'm like, you know what, I'm just going to grunt. The wind's in my favor. I grunt, and I heard a chipmunk go crazy behind me. I'm like, okay, something just caused that chipmunk to go off, and this is like 90 yards away. And within a minute, I heard a snap over here, and there was a buck trotting by, and he stopped. And my first thought was, that's a 2.5-year-old buck. I'm not even going to stand up. And again, the difference between here and here wasn't as clear on a glance, you know, with that deer running by. I had a prolonged encounter with that buck the following day, and that's when I was like, oh man, he is a 3-year-old buck. And I'll tell you some of the things that threw me off when I initially saw him. So one of the things we're looking at here at a 2.5-year-old, I tried to draw this. The front end of the 2.5-year-old is generally a little bit more developed right in here. But your tail end is still, you know, smaller. And so I've been able to tell a lot of times when that front end is a little bit more developed, because sometimes that's the only thing I can use to help me gauge the difference between the 1s and the 2s. And again, it all depends on the area you hunt. As I mentioned over here, there was a 2-inch difference in the back, top of the back to the bottom of the brisket on these mounts, these shoulder mounts. And when that deer's all by itself, just a few inch difference is hard to really tell. So sometimes these deer in here can be tough to make a judgment call on. You just got to do your best. And again, you could have 10 guys look at the same deer, and some will say that's a 2.5-year-old, some will say it's a 3.5-year-old. Because what we have here is, in this 2 and the 3-year-old range, the front end is a little bit more developed in these deer. And I tried to draw it so that 3-year-old, 3.5-year-old collectively is a bigger deer. But sometimes when that deer's all by itself, it's really hard to just say definitively, oh, that's a 3-year-old or that's a 2-year-old. And when you're like me and you hunt a lot of public land, you don't have trail cameras everywhere you hunt. This could be the first time you're encountering that deer. You don't have a history of the deer. And so you just got to do your best. And so some of these judgments in here can be a little challenging to make. So the first time I saw that buck that I was telling you about in that encounter, I looked at it, I saw the front end of the deer was more developed. I knew he was more than a 1.5-year-old. I made a mistake, and you really got to try to not, well, I shouldn't call it a mistake. What I typically do is I look at the body of the deer, and I try to make a determination there. If I'm struggling and I need a little bit more to try to put me in one bracket or another, then I'll kind of try to incorporate the antlers. And as I tried to draw here on a profile view, a lot of times as you get older, those racks get more developed. You're going to have more main beam length. This is a generalization. It's not something that's going to always be very accurate. It's a last case, piece of information that you've got to try to incorporate if you're struggling to determine 2.5, 3.5. Because, for me, I hunt public land, and to get a 3.5-year-old on public land in the mountains where I hunt, this is an accomplishment. And that's what I try to go for. There aren't a lot of scenarios where I'm, running trail cameras and I'm getting anything much more than a 3-year-old in a lot of these locations. So to accomplish that, that's great for me. I'm happy there. Not hunting farmland in the Midwest. So this is an important but tough decision to make. So anyway, I looked up at the buck's rack, and his main beam length just wasn't quite there. He was a 7-point, and I'm going to get this rack right here. This is a rack of an 8-point I shot in, is a mountain deer in New York. He was definitely, without a doubt, a 3.5-year-old deer. I was able to pull pull the bottom jaw out and really study it. And the main beam length, as you can see, it doesn't go that far down the nose of the deer. So the buck that I was talking about in that other hunting situation didn't have much of a main beam length here. So I thought, oh, he's probably just a 2-year-old. And the next night I saw him front on, and he was wider than the tips of his ears. So he didn't have the beam length coming out like toward the camera right here, but it was coming out this way. And so, and he had good, decent mass for mountain deer. And I got to look at the body some more, and he was really, really tearing up the trees. I did a little grunting, and then I ended up throwing in some snort weeds, because as soon as he heard the grunting, he started like thrashing the trees with his antlers because he was trying to show dominance. And obviously you're going to get more of that behavior as the buck gets older in general. But anyway, it was when I had a second encounter, that's when I was able to say, yeah, I really believe this deer that I'm dealing with right here is a 3.5-year-old deer. And I wish I would have shot him the other day, but I didn't. And he was similar to this type of a buck. He was just didn't have this tine right here. And he was straight up mountain deer. So anyway, when we're looking at the 2.5, we got a little more development here. Same within the 3.5-year-old. You're going to see a little more muscle definition where the neck comes down toward the brisket. It gets a little closer to that brisket area. And this is something that you kind of look for as you're getting in those older deer. Where does that neck come down to the brisket? If we jump over to the 4.5-year-old, I tried to depict that a little bit. That neck kind of comes down into that brisket. It's almost seamless when you get down in here. It's almost like all one thing, So the neck is more developed in these deer, in these older deer, and it's going to continue down more to that brisket area there. And so I don't want to skip over 4.5, but 4.5, you got a fully developed body. The skeletal structure of the deer is all grown out. The back end is about the same as the front end, whereas on the 3-year-olds, there's a slight, less development. The front shoulders are a little more developed on your 3.5-year-old. Your 4.5-year-old, you can get more, you can be within 90% of the peak rack of that deer that he's going to produce. And again, the antlers are like, they're that last ditch effort to try to help you age a deer. They're sometimes a little bit helpful, but they're not at all a guarantee. And I'm going to give you some examples of that in a few minutes here. Let me just set this rack down to help you kind of see that. Another thing too, we're usually hunting closer in the rut. And so as these deer get older, that tarsal gland on the back leg, it's going to be bigger and more pronounced and developed as the deer get older. So if you see a buck and you think, you look at that back tarsal gland and it's only like this, if you're trying to decide here, it could be a deer in this range here. As they get a little, in that 3.5-year-old, that tarsal gland's going to look bigger. Up here, your 4.5, it's going to be it's going to be a mess. They're going to really be dark in that back end. Now, when you get into this 5.5 to 7.5-year-old, you're going to see a sway to the belly. Again, forgive my pathetic drawing, but I tried to depict it here. You also, as they get older, can sometimes see a little bit of a sway in the back. And those of you who don't know this already, when a deer dies of natural causes, it's typically because the teeth wear out. That's how a deer dies. So it basically starves to death in the end. And so there's an issue with getting enough nutrition. And so when you get up past, in those later years, if you get much past like that 7.5, there's going to be some body deterioration. That's where you're going to even see more of the sway here. Because the nutrition level's going down, the actual bone structure in the shoulder is going to be a little bit more pronounced. His rump area is going to be a little more bony looking when you get into the older deer beyond that. That's not something very common, and I've actually never seen a deer in that age bracket really in Pennsylvania. And I'm going to make a reference, if you guys were checking my Facebook page right before I went live tonight, I posted a buck picture on my Facebook page that I said I might reference in tonight's talk. I got a buck picture of a really nice 8-pointer this year. I feel like he's probably around that 6-year-old range. He's got a big, you know, swaggy belly here. His rack, when you look at him straight on, he's way out past the tips of the ears. And as you get older, and let me just mention this real quick, generalization, let me grab a couple racks to show you this here. Generalization, your 1.5-year-old deer is a fairly tight rack, especially, you know, a lot of the places I've hunted in the East, this is what you're going to see on a lot of 1.5-year-old. This is a Pennsylvania mountain deer. This is a Maryland mountain deer. This is a 2.5-year-old. So, you know, there's a little bit more development. There's not a lot of mass on this particular one. Sometimes you'll see a little bit more mass development. But the energy of these deer are going into the development of the body. When they're taking food in, they're trying to put it in the body and develop the body. So not as much is spent on the rack. So 1.5, 2.5, and then, but actually here's a 2.5. This is a good example. I shot this last year. This is a 2.5-year-old mountain deer in Pennsylvania. So this buck and the bigger 6-pointer here, they're both 2.5-year-olds, but this one clearly has more mass development. Again, a mountain deer. It was a really nice deer for where I was hunting. And then when you get into that 3.5-year-old, you're going to be out to the tips of the ears. So your 1.5s are typically in this range. Your 2.5s are, let me put this down. This is another 2.5-year-old. Got racks all over the place here. So these are 2.5-year-old bucks. These are both mountain deer. And you're typically going to be closer to the tips of the ears. You're not always going to be out to the tips, a lot of these mountain deer anyway. And then when you get to that 3.5-year-old range, you're generally going to see, let me grab this rack here. I've got racks all over the place. So this is a 3.5-year-old mountain deer from New York. He was to the tips of his ears. This was a 3.5. This is actually an Illinois farm buck. He just didn't have that great of genetics, but you know, they were out to about the tips of their ears, these two bucks. And you know, so as you get older, it gets a little wider. So now when you're in that 4.5-year-old range, you're typically at the tips or beyond in general. And this is a generalization. You're going to have more main beam length typically. And then when you get up in here, you know, you're going to be at your peak, your rack that you're going to get. Referring you back to my Facebook, and if you haven't been on my Facebook page, Sean's Outdoor Adventures, type that in Facebook, you should be able to find it. So the buck that I posted, clearly a nice big buck, big swaggy belly. I think he's a 6-year-old. He's got a good spread past the tips of ears, but he doesn't have much main beam length at all. That buck is not going to score. I mean, if he hits 130, that's going to be probably around what he'll reach with his rack score. This rack was 115, I think, is what this one scored. So he's only about maybe 15 inches more than this one, and he's a fully mature deer. So nutrition plays a factor, genetics play a factor, but my point, and where I started with all that, is the rack is sometimes misleading. So a buck with 15 inches more of antler could be the difference between here and here, you know, on these mountain deer. So if you were to just look at the rack on that big swaggy belly one, you might not think, oh, that's a 6-year-old deer maybe. So, but he's really got the body of that older deer. So, all right, so let me pause there, and let me just give you a couple more examples. I just want to show you this too. This is a New York mountain deer that was shot within probably a half mile. These were probably shot within less than a mile of each other. And so this is a 2.5-year-old. This is a 3.5-year-old. Obviously, you can see the difference in development. This is going to be wider than that 1.5-year-old. So here's the 1.5-year-old. But this is not always a guarantee. And this is one of the things I wanted to show you. Now, let me take my 3-year-old mountain deer from New York and walk on over here. This is a 2-year-old farm deer from Iowa that I shot last year. And this rack actually can fit inside that rack. So here you have a 2-year-old whose rack is out about to the tips of his ears. He's got decent mass, And the difference, a lot of this is, the difference here is nutrition, you know, what the deer could get. And if you ever watched the video I had on this, I passed on a lot of better deer, but it came down to the end of the hunt, and I was hunting all public land. And when you think of it from a management perspective, I probably passed on at least 10 bucks better than him. And it was late November, so I think the majority of those bucks probably made it through. So I didn't think in the grand scheme of things I was going to hurt anything by taking this deer, and you know, I was happy with it. And I actually wasn't sure if he was a 2.5 or 3.5 when I shot him, because it all happened real fast. I thought he might be a 3.5, just looking. Again, he had that more developed front end. He had another buck with him, and he was clearly bigger. I could see that his front end was more developed here, and he was bigger than the buck he was with. So I actually thought he was here. He ended up being here, but I wasn't disappointed in the least. I was very thankful to God for the opportunity. So, all right, you know what? If you have any questions, let's throw up some questions. I was going to talk about deer management in general here, but I'll answer a couple questions if you have them. Just throw up your questions and make sure you put a question mark at the end, and I will try to find it. Let's see. I don't see any question marks, so maybe I don't have it. Wait, is there one? Okay. Here's a question from Robert. Does smoke in your clothes from campfires, grills, cigars, etc. scare deer off? I think you're going to get a mix in the answers there. I personally don't like it, and I don't want to smell like it. Some people, they intentionally smoke their clothes. It's just, I would rather smell like nothing than smell like clothes with smoke in it. Because the other thing you got to remember too, if you smell a campfire and then you smell clothing that has been affected by campfire, it's a different smell. And so that's my opinion in general. Clothes take on odors, and the odors that are coming from the environment are bonding to other things, creating something different. So you're not getting a pure smoke smell. You're getting human clothing that's been affected by smoke, and you're going to have people swear by it. I'm not sitting with those people observing what's the wind direction. I mean, you could have your clothes all smoked out and shoot a giant buck, but it could be the wind was in your favor, and whether you realize it or not. So it's not my thing. I don't like to do it. I'm not going to do it. But there's some people that swear by it, and there's other people who refuse to do it. Okay, looks like I see another question mark. Is the measurement from blacktail the same as whitetail? Measurement, when you say measurement, if you're referring to the overall body, I will have to defer. The reason I say that is I don't have enough experience in studying blacktail, or I have a very minimal exposure to them, and so I don't want to lead you astray. My assumption would be there's going to be a similar trend, and that's because, you know, God made all these animals, and the deer family is very similar throughout it. And being that the blacktail is a very close relative of the whitetail, I would say you're going to have similar characteristics. That would be my assumption. But again, I don't feel qualified to speak on the blacktail. I apologize. In my opinion, if you were a deer, think if your home was on fire, wouldn't you run? Okay. Do you use any type of cover scent, wafers, etc.? I try to use minimal scents of different types. Typically, if I'm going to use a scent, a lot of times I'll use a straight doe urine. I don't ever use doe and heat. I just use doe urine. I've had, in my career, I've been hunting for a long time, and I've had success. Like this buck here, I had doe sent out. I think it might even have been doe and heat sent out. Same with this buck here. Some of my earliest bucks, when you're young and hunting, you're trying to get the buck in and do whatever you can. I had sent out. I don't even know if it actually drew them in. I don't even know what wind direction it was. I wasn't even paying attention to it back then. I had it out. But nowadays, I typically shy away from doe and heat scent regardless. I've had more negative encounters with the doe and heat scent than positive. I've had doe spook and snort and run all through the woods when they smelled other doe and heat scent. I've also had doe ignore it. I've had bucks ignore it. I've had very few experiences where a buck came in excited about doe and heat scent. And I really feel, and I have had some. In fact, if I can find the rack amidst all this mess of racks on the table, here it is. This buck here, I actually used doe and heat scent that day. I put it out and I wasn't going to call. I was like, I'm just going to throw this stuff out and just see what happens. And if you're wondering the brand, I was trying out Buck Bomb, and that was the brand. And after this buck, and this is going back quite a few. Wait, I'm holding the wrong rack. Oh my goodness, that's an 8-pointer. I thought I was holding the 7-pointer. Here's the 7-pointer. This buck here. And Corey Cowan was actually watching the video where I shot this buck the other day. It was my 2011 hunting video. I think right now it's in a playlist. I have a playlist for just my hunting videos, my old ones that are like an hour long. It's at the very bottom of my homepage on YouTube. I think I called this video Steward of the Earth. And part of it was, I was actually praying in the tree stand that day. I was like, God, if there is a wounded buck here that you want me to shoot, please send it by. And within 20 minutes, this buck came limping by me real bad. But he had his nose in the air, and he was rubbing his antlers on trees, and he was licking and grooming himself, and he was responding to the doe and heat scent. That was the only time probably in my whole life where I had a really good positive reaction. I tried Buck Bomb, doe and heat scent a bunch of times after that, and it never worked. So I guess if you get lucky and you get a good bottle, maybe you'll draw on. That was only a 2-year-old buck. Have you ever used Evercalm? No, I have not. What is the average weight of 4-year-old buck in Pennsylvania? I'm actually not positive what the average weight would be of a 4-year-old. This buck right here, I didn't have a chance to weigh him, but dressed out, I would say he was, I would guess maybe around 180, but again, I can't give you a definite answer. I'd have to look up what would be the average on that. What do you think about deer dander spray? I don't use it. What do you think about? Oh, I just read that question. Okay. All right. So it looks like I've gotten most of the questions I'm seeing down at the bottom. If I didn't answer your question, post it right now because I missed it. Wait, here's one I know I just saw that I didn't see before. How do you prep for hunting on public land? Do you have multiple entry points depending on wind? I actually have so many spots on public land that I could hunt a different stand every time I hunt throughout the year if I wanted to. And that's intentional. It is based on wind. It's also based on the acorn production from one year to the next. You know, I have some spots that are great if the oak trees right there are producing acorns that year. If they're not producing acorns, the deer are nowhere near those spots, and so you need to go to a different spot. And so I have, when I'm approaching my public land, it's going to depend on, where are the acorns. That is one of the biggest things where I hunt is public land. It's all mountains. And the main food source is acorns this time, hunting season. So you got to identify that, and you really got to try to find the white oaks. I went on a hunt this past weekend in Maryland for their opening day. Everything went wrong. So I said, you know what? I'm going to get down and explore this other spot that I just looked at on the map that I haven't really looked at. And when I got there, the ground was trashed. I mean, the deer were hammering it so bad. And there was a cluster of white oaks right there, and they were dropping acorns. And man, the leaves were all rustled up from the nose of the deer rooting around in the leaves to find the acorns. There was deer scat everywhere. So I think the next time I get down there, I'm going to probably, if the wind's going to work out, I'm going to try to sit in that spot because it's clearly where the deer are going. Again, that's the example there is that spot's drawing the deer because the acorns are falling right now. If next year that's not producing acorns, that's going to be a waste of time. They're not going to go there. There's no reason for them to go there. Okay, so, and then, if there's different wind directions, you were asking about wind direction, different entry points, I always try to, crosswind or downwind is your best bet trying to get into a spot. And my experience in harvesting a better buck, you know, your better chances if you have a good crosswind. If I'm on the downwind side of where I'm hunting, typically speaking, I don't always have that much success. Why is that, you may ask? It's because the smart deer that get pressured, they're not even going to get out of their bed and move in a direction unless the wind is going to help them in some way. So if a buck is bedded way down over there and the wind's in my face and the food's right in front of me, he's not coming because he can't smell any of this. He'll wait till dark, he'll go over there, he'll loop around, and he'll come in from downwind. So your best bet in a lot of these smarter public land deer is a crosswind. And I don't know if any of you've ever heard that, but I always think about that when I'm in the stand. My best chances of harvesting a deer outside of the rut is when I have a crosswind on my spot, and where I can, you know, if I'm here and the wind's blowing that way, and the deer can kind of come in like from an angle like this, but I'm not upwind of the deer, I got a chance at a good deer, you know. So, all right, last question here. Do the deer mostly move downwind? When deer are pressured, like I was just referring to, they will use the wind in their favor. And I'm talking about the public land deer that I'm hunting. I've hunted on farms, like this deer was from a farm here. I've hunted, you know, in areas where the deer don't seem as bothered by human odor. They don't seem, you know, they move regardless of wind direction. I hunt very difficult deer. You have to do everything just right to get a deer where I hunt in a lot of scenarios. And a lot of times you're looking at a 2.5, or maybe if you're lucky, a 3.5-year-old. You know, I went out Midwest when I got it out there. I mean, it was nothing to have a 3.5-year-old buck walk right underneath you, regardless of wind direction or whatever. And there's so many more deer. So when you have more deer that you're dealing with, there's going to be deer that are going to do whatever. They're not going to care. When you have fewer deer, like where I hunt, and they're pressured, they're going to move a lot of times they're not going to come to a food source, or if there's anything they're concerned about, they're not going to go near that area unless they can totally wind it first, which means they're going to be downwind of that location. So, and that's why a lot of young hunters who are out on public land, like in the mountains of Pennsylvania and stuff, they don't get or see many deer, is because a lot of times they're out there blowing their grunt calls and making all kinds of ruckus. And the deer are just, if they're even bothering, they're either circling downwind or they're just leaving. I mean, out my back door, you could walk for about 4 miles before you come to anything aside from the mountains. And so if a deer has any concern, you know, and it's upwind to me and it hears me grunt or something and doesn't like it, it'll just go. It'll go that way. It'll be like, bye-bye. I'll walk into the wind. I'll smell where I'm going. I don't even need to find out what you are. So, that's what I would say. Have you ever used a saddle? All the time, yes. As far as, used a saddle. Oh, I guess you're referring to those hunting saddles where you, I thought you meant hunt in a saddle. No, I haven't used a saddle. I've sat in them, like at the Great American Outdoor Show, I sat in one. I wasn't a big fan of it. Some people use them. It's just not my thing. So anyway, I am going. Someone's laughing at something I said. I'm going to stop the question and answers for a second, and I want to just talk a little bit about deer management in general before I close tonight's live show. And it has to do with doe management. And I've matured a lot in my understanding and thought process with all this. And I'm sure there's a lot of people in various stages of their understanding. When I first started thinking about deer management, I was very angry because where I hunt, you know, there's very few deer in some of the areas where I hunt. And so I would go a week without even seeing a deer, and that's very frustrating. And so then I just thought, you know, I listened to what a lot of people had complained about. If you're from Pennsylvania or ever hunted there, you might have heard how the Game Commission, the Pennsylvania Game Commission, changed the ways that those could be harvested so that the numbers were dropped way down. And everybody started to complain and say, don't shoot the does. Don't shoot any of the does because we don't have any deer. And, you know, if you want to get deer back, yeah, first of all, you got to stop shooting does. However, we were in a crisis situation because we didn't think about habitat management in Pennsylvania. And basically the way they did it was the Game Commission gets their monies from the sale of licenses, so they kept as many deer out there as they could so that sportsmen would go out and see a lot of deer, have a great time, and want to buy their license next year. You know, there'd be people go out and they'd see 30 or 40 deer every time they went hunting. I have never experienced that in Pennsylvania in my life because that was before, you know, my time essentially. What they did though is by having that many deer, the deer ate everything. There was no forest regeneration. So when you would go out into the forest, you could see for hundreds and hundreds of yards. And if that's the way it is in your location, that means there's nothing really for the deer to eat. You know, right now there's acorns falling, great. But the rest of the year, if it's a mountain deer, there's really not much for it. And that's a major problem. And so they had to drop the deer numbers way down, start implementing habitat management to try to rehabilitate the habitat. You need food to carry the deer population. Out in the Midwest, there's farms everywhere. Hunting is a major industry now, especially out there. You have outfitters, they leave food up all throughout the winter. So there's something to sustain the deer. You don't have that when you're in the mountains. You know, the only food available is the twigs on the small growing, you know, trees and bushes throughout the wintertime. Well, obviously they're not growing that time of year, but the small bushes is what the deer are eating to survive. And if you don't have any of that, there's no food. And so we were in a situation where there was no food to carry the deer. And so they had to drop the numbers way down. And so now that brings into the context of this whole discussion, what can the habitat sustain? What can it carry? So wherever you live and wherever you hunt, you know, if you want to think about managing the deer, the first thing you need to do is look at what state is my habitat in? Do we have lush habitat, good forest regeneration? Is there a lot for the deer to eat in the wintertime? Like, it's harsh winter sometimes in these northern climates where you have snow. You need food for those deer. And so having forest regeneration and lots of saplings growing. I hunt a lot in New York. I've always been very proud of the state of New York in their management plan that they have. When I walk into a forest in New York, it's actually very frustrating as a hunter because you're not allowed to trim any of the branches, and it's very thick. So there's so many places I would love to hunt, but I can't because there's no shooting lane. So, but I'm happy in the sense that there's good habitat for the deer. They have lots to browse on in the wintertime. And so Pennsylvania's been behind the ball, but they're trying to catch up now. They're doing more controlled burns. And if you own your own land and you think about deer management, I mean, first think about your property habitat management, and that goes beyond putting in a food plot. You know, you want good browse, good thick areas for the deer, not just for bedding, but for feeding on in those colder months or the winter months, or, you know, maybe your food plot dies out or they eat it to the ground. Well, now what are they going to eat? You got to have, you know, good forest regeneration on your own property. And so those are some things that I would encourage you to look at. And then when it comes to deer management in that context, you know, if we're saying don't shoot the does, well, make sure you have habitat to sustain the deers if you're bringing them back. If not, start complaining to the agent. If you're talking about public land, complain to the agencies saying we need habitat management right now. This is overdue. And that's where your energy should be, in addition to, you know, trying to worry about getting the deer numbers up. You need food for them to eat, and that comes in the way of habitat throughout the year, not just food plots. So anyway, let's see if there's any other questions that have popped up. If you have any, ask them right now. Otherwise, I'm going to close out because I have a lot to do tonight. And let's see. Does the presence of black bear have an influence on bucks? I would say yes. I have had many hunts where I've encountered black bears, and very rarely do I have encounters with deer after I've had an encounter with a black bear on a hunt. And usually it's because the deer will shy away from the black bear. Black bear can be viewed as a predator animal to the deer. Black bear do eat fawns. There's been some studies that there's been excessive fawn predation due to black bear. And so I would say yes, the black bears can have an impact. If you're getting a lot of black bear, there's a possibility that they're keeping the deer at bay. Like I've got a trail camera up. That buck that I referred to on my Facebook page earlier, that spot I have a ton of black bear that hit that area too. And anytime the black bear are there, the deer aren't there that day. And it's because the deer smell the bear, they know what their paw prints smell like, and typically speaking, in general, they're going to shy away from that because they don't want any issues. Deer prefer to stay away from predator type animals, and so you're not typically going to see a black bear and a deer hanging out under the same oak tree eating acorns. All right, do food plots still work in agricultural areas? Absolutely. If you plant something that the deer will like that's not going to be provided in the other agricultural crops, then you could have a little honey hole right there. So look at what deer like, and then look at what's being offered and see if there's a food plot source that you could provide that's different than they can get from the other crop fields. Any tips for hunting a CWD area? Can't use any lure, just cover scent. I use a 2D decoy currently. You know, I actually, when I go hunting, I try to push my skills to put me where the deer are going to be without needing any scent, without needing any calls of any type. And that's an expression of skill. So my suggestion is work hard on developing the skills you need to pinpoint where the deer will be. You know, pinpoint what their key feeding areas are going to be, their key bedding areas, and then how you can be in those areas in an effective, stealthy way before they get there and undetected when they arrive so that you can get a shot. And that takes work, and that's a skill set. And so I encourage you to really focus in on developing your ability to pinpoint those locations and put yourself in them within 20 yards. That's my goal to myself is I want to find where I think the deer are going to be, and I want to have my tree stand location effectively placed within 20 yards of that so that I don't need any deer call. I don't need any other scent. I don't need anything except that skill to put me there. So that's my encouragement. Someone's requesting a prayer, all the people in Texas and Florida. Absolutely. I'm glad you reminded me of that because that's something I wanted to mention tonight. Every spring and fall, I typically do a fundraiser on my channel. And rather than do a separate fundraiser this year, with everything that's going on and all the fundraising that's taking place, I want to encourage everybody that's watching, please, you know, reach out to our brothers and sisters in these areas where they've been hit real hard and try to, you know, dig into your pocket a little bit and give a little contribution. I know my son's in Catholic school and they're collecting funds through the school, and 100% of those proceeds are going to those victims. And so I like finding resources like that where I know the money's going toward what I'm putting it toward. So look into that. These are our home people, and we need to rise up and help them out. I'm so happy to see so many people coming together to do that, and I just want to encourage you to continue down that path. And please don't be a procrastinator about it and think, oh, that's a nice idea, I'll get to it later or whatever. So often when we put something off, we don't get to it. Maybe right now you can, if you're on the internet, like on a computer or whatever's convenient, you open another tab and type in like, where can I give money for the hurricane victims, and look for a reputable source and do it before this evening's over, you know, without putting it off, because these people need us, you know. And that's what being human is about. We're in a family. I always try to make people feel like when they come to my YouTube channel, they're a part of a community. I really try hard to respond to people, and that's why I do it. This is my Sean's Outdoor Adventures community that I'm trying to create and provide so that other people can come together and feel like, hey, I like coming here because I connect with these people. But that's all of humanity. We really, I mean, we got to reach out and help others when we can, and this is a great opportunity. And it's through crisis that I think we do come together better as a people, and maybe that's why God allows it, just because it inspires us to be the excellent people we can be. So I just want to thank you, God, for Silvio putting that up there and reminding me, and I ask you, God, please, to help these victims and inspire the viewers to contribute any way they can. If there's any talent that they can contribute to help these people, aside from money or their own prayers, please inspire them. And I do ask this in your name, Jesus. Amen. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight. And next week, what I want to talk about is tree stand placement and tree stand angles. There's so many variations in how you set up your tree stand that can make a huge difference in you being successful, and that's not something everybody thinks about. But there have been so many times where I'm sure people have ruined their hunts because they didn't angle their tree the right way or the tree stand right on a tree, and so the deer was able to pick them out easier. So I just want to talk about some ideas and practices that I think you can utilize to help you be effective when that moment of truth arrives. So I'm going to get up here and try to learn how to turn this thing off. And say goodbye and good night, and thank you again for tuning in, and God bless you all.